Okay, so American imperialism. This is the time that we talked about is important for us to understand because it's going to set up our involvement with the world. So we're going to go from an isolated country that's concerned with fighting the Civil War and trying to survive and just dealing with its own little continent, little area, to one that expands to the west and to one that expands around the northern hemisphere. So we're going to start out with a definition of what imperialism is. And so, real simple definition to put down in your notes: imperialism is a policy in which the stronger countries extend their control over the weaker territories or countries. That could be economic, political, or military control. And what we're looking at is a time by the 1880s, we're recovering from the Civil War, the factories are starting to grow, the country's starting to do better economically, and we start to focus on how we should become like the European powers and how we should gain overseas colonies or overseas possessions. And there's a few different reasons that we're going to look at for that. So some of the factors that led to this desire to have overseas territories, one of them was a stronger military. People wanted a stronger military so that we could show the world that we were strong, kind of this macho look at us, and an ability to protect ourselves from undue influence from other countries. The second one was the business aspect of it, search for new markets. We were producing more than we could consume, and the business owners were looking for places to sell things. So we wanted consumers to buy our products, and we also wanted materials to make our products from. And that leads us to look to other places where we have influence and helps us spread American imperialism. And belief in cultural superiority is the third one. And what we're looking at here is the idea that we are a great culture, we are Christian, we are the superior culture in the world, and so we want to spread that culture to the people that are uncivilized or less like us. And so social Darwinism plays in there, racial superiority plays in there, and civilizing the natives, or the idea of spreading Christianity, plays in there. So there's kind of three different factors that lead to this, and they're all mixed together, so they're not separate in and of themselves, but these are why we move on. So some of the things that we are looking at as far as acquiring possessions, and this starts before the rest of them. This is back at the end of the Civil War. Secretary of State Seward decides that buying Alaska would be a good thing. Alaska at that point was nothing important. The Russians didn't even want it, so we decided, okay, fine, we'll buy Alaska. He gets made fun of, people pick on him. It's called Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox, but we now know that that was a good deal because of all the resources, including oil, timber, gold, and things that were there. We will talk about Alaska later because, and you can see in the picture how close it is to Russia during the Cold War. That becomes somewhat of an issue. But for now, all you need to know is that in 1867, we purchased Alaska. Hawaii is a little bit more complicated than Alaska because we basically take control over it, we acquire it. So our involvement with Hawaii spans back to the 1820s, so just a real quick timeline. You don't have to write all these down, you just have to understand that we were involved in Hawaii for sort of an extended period of time. So in the 1820s, we start being involved, I guess, with them, with the Hawaiian people, by setting up Christian schools. Remember the cultural superiority part that goes all the way back to the 1820s. And we start trying to produce sugar and produce there. So businesses start setting up shop in the 1820s. Over the next 50 years or so, Americans control most of the wealth in Hawaii because they are exporting sugar. And we decide that in 1875 that we're going to make an agreement to trade sugar without import taxes. But that's not good enough for American planners. They want it to become part of the United States so that that agreement would become permanent. In 1887, we build a naval fueling or coaling station at Pearl Harbor. And those coaling stations are really important back then because to be able to have a military or a navy that goes around the world back then you had to be able to load your ship up with coal every so often, sort of like a gas station for a car. And so one of the first ones we built was in Hawaii. In 1890, we put a tax back on sugar from Hawaii. A new queen goes to the throne, and basically she tries to stop Americans from controlling her homeland. During that time period, American businessmen get upset, they overthrow her, put a government in, and it doesn't work very well. And in 1898, McKinley decides to proclaim Hawaii an American territory without allowing the Hawaiians to vote for what they have. So they become part of our country just because we decide they are, and later they become a state, but they're not really given much of a say. So on to kind of the big picture of what we're looking at with American imperialism, and that's the Spanish-American War. And this is what we were watching with Rough Riders, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what we have is a situation where the Spanish, along with some of the other European countries, have colonies spread throughout the world. The Spanish just happen to be in control of Cuba, which is right off the coast of Florida. So we don't really like that too much because it threatens us, and we think that now that we're a powerful country that it should be sort of in our control, or it should be on its own. So here's the history with Americans' interest in Cuba. Cuba revolted against Spain in around 1870, and the Cubans gained some rights from the Spanish. We, during that time period, invest a lot of money in Cuban sugar plantations, and in 1895 there's a full-on Cuban revolution against the Spanish. So in 1896 the Spanish send a general to take control of Cuba, and he pretty much puts a whole bunch of people in concentration camps, and a lot of them died. The idea behind the concentration camps was that he was going to protect the people from the rebels in the countryside, so he basically moved them into closer areas. It didn't obviously work because he wasn't protecting people, he was trying to keep them from fighting against the Spanish government. So his actions lead Americans to dislike what the Spanish are doing, make it upset, like you start to see in the movie. People are afraid or angry. They think that it's our job to do something about it. So in 1897, President McKinley takes office, and he doesn't want to fight with the Spanish. So he's trying to avoid a war. The Spanish recall the governor or the general that they have there. They reform the concentration camps. They redo everything, but that's not enough. The New York Journal publishes a letter that basically makes McKinley look like a wimp, and that was the end of that. He pretty much has to do something at this point. So the catalyst to the war we're going to talk about in a second. There's one particular event that pushes America into the war, but what you need to understand is going into this, some people wanted to stay out of the war. They didn't think it was our fight. We had nothing to do with it. Some people wanted to protect the government, to protect business investments. Okay, mostly sugar plantations, but at one point we owned pretty much all of Cuba, all the land in Cuba. So there were other investments, but sugar plantations were the biggest one. And others wanted to be involved in the war because of the principles of freedom and liberty. And you saw that in the first part of the video, or you'll see it in the rest of the video later, where there's all these different reasons for wanting to go to war in Cuba. So the catalyst, February 15th, 1898, an American warship that McKinley had ordered into the port of Havana exploded. We don't really know why it exploded, but the newspapers took it and ran with it and said that it was the Spanish blowing up the American ship. And so the battle cry kind of becomes "Remember the Maine." And it's sort of a situation where, even though it may not have been the case, everybody blamed this on Spanish. Everybody was kind of upset and ready to go to war anyway, and this was what put it over the edge. And part of it being put over the edge was this idea of we already wanted to do this, or a lot of people wanted to do this, and this was sort of like the match that started the fire. So the Spanish-American War is a multi-front war. And what you have to remember is that this is nowhere near Spain. This is spread out way away from Spain. So it's a lot harder for the Spanish to be able to protect all of their colonies at one time. So the first thing that we do is we attack the Spanish warships in the Philippines. And Commodore Dewey, who is the American general during the battle, leads a naval battle, and we pretty much wipe out the Spanish. At this particular point, the Filipinos support us because they wanted to get freedom from Spain. We also fight in Cuba. That's what you're watching preparation for in Rough Riders. But in Cuba, we had forces that were pretty much untrained, poorly equipped, and were relatively small. That being said, they're still successful in Cuba because the Spanish really don't want to fight. They aren't that into it because they know how close we are and they know how far away from their country they are. Part of the issue behind the war is this idea of newspapers, in particular, encouraging the war. So newspaper owners, particularly Hearst and Pulitzer, wanted to sell papers. That's how they made their money. So they figured that if they had these crazy kind of over-the-top headlines, that they would be able to sell more papers. And so in a lot of ways, they encourage the war. And that was what we know as yellow journalism. And it's called like sensational or over-the-top or exaggerated writing to lure or enrage readers. So if you look at just a couple of the headlines: great victory at sea for the Americans, vengeance for the Maine, Spain's Asiatic fleet burned and sunk. It's supposed to be kind of over the top. The spirit of war pervades the breast of all of Americans, and so they're trying to get people to read by saying how great the war is going and saying that we need to go to war and sort of sensationalizing and putting it over the top. They're not being the voice of reason. They're not trying to calm people down, and so the newspapers push the war, encourage the war, get people fired up about the war. And a lot of that has to do with them trying to make money and sell papers. So the Rough Riders that the video shows, if we get to the end, you'll see more of it. And they were volunteer cavalry, and Theodore Roosevelt started that. So it was a bunch of guys that decided, yeah, we want to go to Cuba. We'll volunteer. We'll go over there. And they become famous for their attack on San Juan Hill. And they were sort of the heroes of the war, and out of that, Roosevelt becomes a war hero. Like I said before, he's the only president to win the Medal of Honor, so kind of a big deal, and it sort of cements his place in history as someone to be reckoned with, and it pretty much gets him the popularity he needed to become president later on. So there's a picture of them. If we get to the end of the video, you'll see that same picture at the end of the movie. It's only a 15-week war, so it's not really a long, drawn-out, extended war. The Treaty of Paris ends the war. And so at the end of that, we have to decide, what do we do? We have control essentially of the Philippines, we have control essentially of Cuba, and we have control essentially of Puerto Rico. So now what do we do? Should we annex the Philippines, make it part of our country? What should we do? So McKinley said that we should Christianize the Filipinos. Basically, what the decision is that the Filipinos can't rule themselves, so that we are going to have to stay there and make sure that they aren't taken advantage of, or that they don't turn into some sort of uneducated, crazy country. And so Christianize is what we use as an excuse. And this is basically our justification for imperialism. So it's like, this is an important place, it's too important for them to rule on their own, so we're going to stay here and make sure that it's done right. So we have this sort of backdrop of the Spanish-American War leads us to be able to acquire new land. So the first one's Puerto Rico. The little map there shows you roughly where Puerto Rico is. Some of the Puerto Ricans did not want to be part of the United States. Some of them did. The same debate that goes on today. Some wanted to be partially U.S. citizens and partially not. And we didn't know after the Spanish-American War what we were going to do with Puerto Rico. So what ends up happening is we have U.S. military rule, and then we have a sort of a series of acts that are set up to give the Puerto Ricans control over their own country to some extent. So the Foraker Act set up a local government, gave the U.S. president power to appoint leaders, but it did not allow them complete independence. So the U.S. wanted to make sure that we had a presence in the Caribbean, so that we, if we ever needed to, that we had military capabilities there. So we don't want to turn their country over to them. And a couple of other issues with that. In 1901, the Supreme Court says that people that are in American territories aren't always protected by the Constitution, which is important. It means they have some rights, but not the same rights that we do here in the continental United States. But by 1917, U.S. citizenship is granted to Puerto Ricans. And we talked in class before about Puerto Rico having kind of unique, could they be the 51st state? Could they not? This is the origins of that debate, and sort of gives them some rights, but they can't vote, they can't elect officials, but they do have the right to U.S. citizenship. So you can go back and forth to Puerto Rico without a passport. So it's a little bit different than most other places. Cuba. We are in Cuba as an idea to give them their independence. Cuba, if you didn't know, there's a little map, it's right off the coast of Florida. So when we make sure that the Cubans have independence, now we have to decide what are we going to do. So McKinley goes to Congress and asks for permission to fight in Cuba. Okay, so Congress issues a joint resolution saying that it's okay, go ahead, use military force to get the Spanish out. So there's a couple amendments to that resolution that you need to know about. The first one's the Teller Amendment, and it basically said, okay, look, we don't want to take over Cuba, we just want to get the Spanish out of here. Okay, so that's the first thing. We didn't want the Cubans to start fighting against us. So after the war, we stayed in Cuba, and some of our American troops stayed in charge of Cuba. When the Cubans didn't particularly like that, we just kicked them out. We arrested them and exiled them. So what else happened here? The Second Amendment you need to know about is the Platt Amendment, which replaces the Teller Amendment, and it's the conditions for our withdrawal. So we say, fine, we're going to leave. We said we weren't going to stay. We're going to leave, but here's what you have to do to get us to leave. First of all, you can't make treaties with anybody else. You can't permit any foreign power to control that. If you do, we reserve the right to intervene in Cuba. You can't go into debt, and we could buy or lease land in Cuba for naval or refueling stations. Sort of an interesting thing. We did not really care if the Cubans liked this or not. We said, too bad, you're going to take it or we're not going to leave. We made Cuba a protectorate, so we controlled them, but we didn't really have any influence. We said, if you kind of don't do these things, then we'll come back. And they were that way for 31 years. And basically, what we're saying is Cuba is too close to us, and we have too many interests in Cuba to let you guys do whatever you want. So if you do these things, then we're okay. Philippines, a little bit different. We decide we're going to stay in the Philippines, and that's not good for the Filipinos, so they decide that they're going to fight against us. So we end up having a war against the Filipinos. So the Philippine-American War lasts for roughly 3 years, and it's like sort of one of those things where we come out of the looking pretty bad. One of the things we're going to talk about is the atrocities for the Filipino War. So we'll talk more about that later in class. The last part of American imperialism that we need to talk about is China. And we said one of the reasons for imperialism was economic markets, resources, and China is kind of like the holy grail of that because of how many people they have. So if you want to be able to sell to customers, you want to be able to sell to China. So what we come up with is this open door policy. We recognize right off the top that we can't control China. It's too big and it's too far away. So what are we going to do? We're going to come up with a policy where everyone shares it, and so no one's fighting over China. So you see the little cartoon down there, you have the different countries all dividing China up. And we'll talk more about the open door policy because it really helps to tie us into European affairs and really leads us to get involved into World War I. But what it is the major powers, U.S. and Europe, so Germany, France, Britain, etc., wanted to be able to trade for China, with China. And so we come up with this open door policy, and it's written by John Hay. And it's the idea that we would all share trading rights in China. So we're not going to compete over China, we're not going to fight a war for China, we're just going to equally share. Well, the Chinese don't particularly like this, at least not all of them do. So the Boxer Rebellion is a situation where a group of Chinese rebels fought against foreign influence in China. They were called the Boxers, that's why it's called the Boxer Rebellion. Ultimately, the Boxer Rebellion fails, and thousands of Chinese people die, and the foreign countries stay in China. And that foreign influence in China is going to be part of the conflict that's going to lead us into World War I and later into World War II against the Japanese. So we'll talk more about that later, but you need to understand that the open door policy is the idea that maybe we should just share influence in China instead of compete or fight over it. So that is American imperialism. You need to make sure you get your notes completed. This is sort of the overview, and we'll do 4 more activities in class, and we'll read a little bit from the textbook. But this is the part where it kind of gives you the idea of where we're going. So make sure if you missed anything that you go back and get that.